Lieutenant Alexander Hartwell had served the crown for 12 years without a single blemish on his record. At 34, he was the youngest officer ever promoted to lead the Queen's personal guard, a position that required absolute loyalty, unwavering discipline, and complete discretion. His uniform was always perfect, his boots polished to a mere shine, and his devotion to duty was legendary among his peers. But on this gray morning in November, Alexander stood in the palace corridors, feeling like his world was crumbling around him. In his hands, he held a folder containing documents that would change everything he believed about the institution he had sworn to protect with his life. The discovery had been accidental. While conducting a routine security sweep of the palace, Archives Alexander had stumbled upon a hidden compartment behind an old filing cabinet. Inside were papers that revealed a conspiracy so shocking, so deeply rooted in corruption, that he could barely comprehend what he was reading. The documents detailed a secret agreement between high-ranking palace officials and a foreign arms dealer. For the past 5 years, the palace had been quietly facilitating illegal weapons sales to conflict zones around the world. The profits were being funneled through fake charities that claimed to help war orphans, but instead lined the pockets of corrupt officials. What made it even worse was the signature at the bottom of several key documents. Lord Chancellor Pemberton, the Queen's most trusted advisor and Alexander's direct superior, the same man who had personally recruited Alexander into the Guard, who had mentored him, who had become like a father to him after Alexander's own father died in military service. Alexander sat in his small quarters, staring at the evidence spread. Across his desk, photographs showed meetings between palace officials and known criminals. Bank records revealed millions of pounds flowing through accounts connected to the fake charities. Most damning of all were handwritten notes detailing how the weapons were being used to fuel civil wars in 3 different African nations. The moral weight of the discovery was crushing. Alexander thought about the oath he had taken when he joined the Guard, to protect the crown and its reputation at all costs. He had sworn absolute loyalty, promised to keep palace secrets, vowed to put duty above personal feelings. But he also remembered why he had wanted to serve in the first place. As a young man, Alexander had been inspired by stories of brave soldiers who fought to protect innocent people. He had believed that serving the crown meant serving justice, that protecting the royal family meant protecting the values they represented to the world. Now he was faced with evidence that some of the most powerful people in the kingdom were profiting from the suffering of innocent civilians thousands of miles away. Children were dying because of weapons sold with the palace's knowledge and approval. Families were being torn apart by conflicts that were being deliberately prolonged for financial gain. Alexander's hands trembled as he picked up one particular photograph. It showed Lord Chancellor Pemberton shaking hands with Viktor Kozlov, a Russian arms dealer who was wanted by international authorities for war crimes. The photo was taken in the palace's private dining room, the same room where Alexander had shared Christmas dinner with the Chancellor's family. Just months ago, the betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. Chancellor Pemberton had been more than just a superior officer. He had been a mentor, a friend, almost family. When Alexander's mother had been diagnosed with cancer 3 years ago, the Chancellor had personally arranged for her to receive the best medical care available. When Alexander had doubted his own abilities as a leader, the Chancellor had encouraged him, guided him, helped him become the man he was today. How could someone who had shown such personal kindness be involved in something so evil? Alexander stood up and walked to his window, which overlooked the palace gardens. Below, he could see tourists taking pictures, families enjoying their visit, children laughing as they pointed at the guards in their colorful uniforms. These people trusted the royal family, believed in what the crown represented. They had an idea that behind the ceremonial grandeur, some of the people they respected were making money from human suffering. The weight of responsibility settled on Alexander's shoulders like a physical burden. He was the only person who knew the truth. It's the only person who could stop this from continuing. But exposing the corruption would mean destroying everything he had worked for, betraying the trust of people he cared about, and almost certainly ending his career in disgrace. The Guard's code was clear. Loyalty to the crown came before everything else. Personal feelings moral concerns, even legal obligations were secondary to protecting the reputation and interests of the royal family. Speaking out about palace corruption, even if it was true, was considered the ultimate betrayal. But Alexander couldn't stop thinking about the victims. According to the documents, the weapons being sold had been used in attacks on schools, hospitals, and refugee camps. Thousands of innocent people had died, and more would continue to die if nothing was done to stop the illegal trade. He picked up a letter from one of the fake charities, addressed to potential donors. It described heartbreaking conditions in war-torn regions, asked for money to help orphan children, promised that donations would go directly to food and medical supplies. The letter was signed by Lady Margaret Thornfield, a respected philanthropist and close friend of the royal family. Alexander knew Lady Thornfield personally. She'd always seemed genuinely caring, truly concerned about helping others. Either she was involved in the deception, or she was being used without her knowledge. Either possibility made Alexander feel sick. As evening approached, Alexander made a decision that would change the course of his life forever. He carefully photographed every document, creating digital copies that he uploaded to a secure, encrypted drive. Then he returned the originals to their hiding place, making sure everything looked exactly as he had found it. He would need time to think, to plan, to figure out the right way to handle this impossible situation. But one thing was certain: he couldn't pretend he had never seen the evidence. The faces of the victims in those reports haunted him, and he knew they would continue to haunt him until he found the courage to do what was right. Alexander Hartwell, perfect soldier and loyal guard, was about to discover just how much his principles were worth. 3 days passed, and Alexander found it increasingly difficult to maintain his usual composure. During his shifts guarding the Queen's private chambers, he found himself studying the faces of the senior officials who came and went. Which ones knew about the weapons dealing? Which ones were profiting from the scheme? Which ones, like him, might be completely unaware of what was happening in the shadows of the palace? Lord Chancellor Pemberton continued to treat Alexander with the same warmth and respect he had always shown. During their daily briefings, he asked about Alexander's mother's health, complimented his leadership of the guard unit, and spoke enthusiastically about Alexander's bright future in royal service. Each friendly interaction made the betrayal feel more painful and the decision about what to do more complicated. On Wednesday evening, Alexander was summoned to an emergency meeting in the Chancellor's private office. When he arrived, he found several high-ranking officials already seated around the polished oak table. The atmosphere was tense, and Alexander immediately sensed that something significant had happened. "Alexander, please sit down," the Chancellor said, his usually warm voice carrying a note of concern. "We have a situation that requires the utmost discretion." Alexander took his seat, trying to keep his expression neutral, despite the anxiety building in his chest. Around the table sat Lady Margaret Thornfield, whom he now suspected was either a victim or a conspirator in the weapons scheme.
Also present
Were General Morrison, head of palace security, and Sir Richard Blackwood, the royal family's chief legal counsel. "Gentlemen, lady," the Chancellor began, "we've received intelligence that suggests someone may be attempting to gather compromising information about palace operations. Our sources indicate that certain sensitive areas of the building may have been accessed by unauthorized personnel." Alexander's blood ran cold. Were they talking about his discovery of the hidden documents? Had someone seen him in the archives? His training kicked in. He managed to maintain a calm exterior while his mind raced through the implications. General Morrison leaned forward, his weathered face serious. "We believe this may be connected to recent inquiries from investigative journalists who have been asking questions about palace financial records. Someone may be feeding them information. Situation is potentially very damaging," Sir Richard added, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "If certain operational details were to become public, it could cause significant embarrassment to the Crown and undermine public confidence in the institution." Lady Margaret looked genuinely confused and concerned. "What kind of operational details? I thought all our charitable work was completely transparent and above board." The Chancellor and Sir Richard exchanged a quick glance that Alexander didn't miss. It was clear that Lady Margaret was not part of the inner circle that knew about the weapons dealing. She was being used, just as Alexander had suspected. "Margaret, we're still assessing the full scope of the potential breach," the Chancellor said carefully. "For now, we need to ensure that all personnel with access to sensitive areas understand the critical importance of maintaining confidentiality." General Morrison turned to Alexander. "Lieutenant Hartwell, as head of the Queen's Guard, we need you to conduct a thorough review of access logs for all restricted areas of the palace. Anyone who has been in areas beyond their normal duties needs to be questioned and cleared." Alexander nodded, hoping his voice would remain steady. "Of course, General. When would you like me to begin?" "Immediately," the Chancellor replied. "And Alexander, I want you to personally handle any interviews with personnel who may have had unauthorized access. This matter requires someone with absolute discretion and loyalty." The irony was overwhelming. They were asking him to investigate his own discovery, to hunt down the very person who had uncovered their crimes. Alexander realized that they trusted him completely, never imagining that their most loyal guard could be the source of their problems. As the meeting concluded, the Chancellor placed a fatherly hand on Alexander's shoulder. "I know I can count on you, my boy. You've never let me down, and I know you never will." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. Here was a man who had been like a father to him, expressing complete faith in his loyalty, while simultaneously asking him to help cover up crimes that were causing immense human suffering. After leaving the meeting, Alexander walked through the palace corridors in a daze. The familiar surroundings that had once felt like home now seemed foreign and threatening. Every shadow could be hiding a conspiracy. Every friendly smile could be masking corruption. He found himself in the palace chapel, a small, ornate room, where members of the royal family and their staff came for quiet reflection. Alexander rarely visited the chapel, but tonight he felt drawn to its peaceful atmosphere. He sat in one of the wooden pews and tried to sort through the impossible. The situation he faced, the investigation they wanted him to conduct, would inevitably lead back to him. The access logs would show that he had been in the archives during the time period they were examining. When that happened, he would be questioned, and Alexander knew he was a terrible liar. Honest nature, which had always been considered one of his greatest strengths, would now become his downfall. But more importantly, he was being asked to actively participate in covering up crimes. It wasn't enough that he remained silent about what he had discovered. They wanted him to help hunt down anyone else who might expose the truth. They wanted him to become part of the conspiracy. Alexander thought about his father, who had died serving his country in Afghanistan. His father had always taught him that a soldier's first duty was to protect innocent people. The uniform meant something beyond just following orders. "Son," his father had said during their last conversation, "there will come a time when you have to choose between doing what you're told and doing what's right. When that moment comes, remember that your conscience is more important than your career." That moment had arrived. Alexander pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for Sarah Mitchell, an investigative journalist he had met at a charity event 6 months ago. Sarah worked for The Guardian and had a reputation for fearless reporting on government corruption. At the time, Alexander had been impressed by her intelligence and integrity. Though he never imagined he would need to contact her under circumstances like these, his finger hovered over her number as he wrestled with the final decision. Once he made this call, there would be no going back. He would be betraying the trust of people who cared about him, ending a career he loved, and probably facing criminal charges for violating his oath of secrecy. But he would also be stopping the flow of weapons to conflict zones, potentially saving countless innocent lives, and exposing a corruption that went to the very heart of an institution that was supposed to represent the best of British values. Alexander took a deep breath, said a quick prayer for courage, and dialed Sarah Mitchell's number. The phone rang. Twice before she answered. Sarah Mitchell speaking. "Ms. Mitchell, this is Lieutenant Alexander Hartwell from the Royal Guard. We met at the Children's Hospital charity event last spring. I have information you need to hear, but we need to meet in person. It's about corruption at the highest levels of the palace, and it's bigger than you can imagine." There was a pause, then Sarah's voice, now sharp with professional interest. "How do I know this isn't some kind of setup?" Alexander looked around the chapel at the stained glass windows that depicted scenes of moral courage and sacrifice, because I'm about to risk everything I've worked for to tell you the truth. Because if I don't, more innocent people are going to die. The meeting with Sarah Mitchell took place 2 days later at a small cafe in South London, far from the palace and far from anywhere Alexander might be recognized. He arrived early, choosing a corner table where he could watch the entrance while remaining partially hidden from view. His hands were shaking as he ordered coffee. He kept checking his watch every few minutes. Sarah arrived exactly on time, her sharp eyes immediately scanning the cafe before settling on Alexander. She was younger than he remembered, probably. In her early 30s, with short auburn hair and an intensity that made her seem like she was always thinking 3 steps ahead. "Lieutenant Hartwell," she said, sliding into the seat across from him. "You sounded scared on the phone." "That's unusual for someone in your position." Alexander managed a weak smile. "Please call me Alexander. And yes, I'm terrified. What I'm about to tell you will end my career and probably land me in prison." Sarah pulled out a small recording device and set it on the table between them. "Before we begin, I need to know, are you doing this for money?" "Against your superiors?" "Oh," Alexander replied firmly. "I'm doing this because innocent people are dying and I have the power to stop it." For the next 2 hours, Alexander laid out everything he had discovered. He showed Sarah the photographs he had taken of the documents, explained the connections between the palace officials and the arms dealers, and detailed how the fake charities were being used to launder money. Sarah listened intently, asking sharp questions and taking detailed notes. "This is incredible," Sarah said finally. "If even half of this is true, it's the biggest scandal in royal history. But Alexander, you understand that I'll need to verify all of this independently. Can't just take your word for it, no matter how compelling the evidence looks." "I understand," Alexander replied. "But please be careful. These people have a lot of power, and they won't hesitate to use it to protect themselves." Dad. Sarah studied Alexander's face carefully. "Why are you really doing this? You could have just transferred to another position, put in for early retirement. Found a way to distance yourself from the situation. Now why risk everything?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. 3 weeks ago, I would have told you that my duty was to protect the crown at all costs. I believed that loyalty to the institution was the highest virtue a guard could possess." He looked up, meeting Sarah's eyes. "But then I saw those documents. I saw the names of the victims, the photos of destroyed villages, the reports of children killed by weapons that were sold with palace approval. And I realized that protecting the crown doesn't mean protecting the people who are corrupting it from within." Sarah nodded, understanding in her expression. "What's your plan now?" "They're already suspicious that someone has been accessing sensitive areas. It won't be long before they figure out it was you." "I know," Alexander said. "That's why I'm telling you everything now. Once they identify me as the leak, I won't be able to help anymore. You'll have to take it from here." "What about your family? Your mother, you mentioned she's been ill. Happens to her if you lose your position and pension?" The question hit Alexander hard. He had been trying not to think about the personal cost of his decision. His mother's medical treatments were expensive, and his guard's salary provided excellent health benefits. Without his income, he wasn't sure how he would continue to pay for her care. "I'll figure something out," he said quietly. "I can't let financial concerns stop me from doing what's right." Sarah reached across the table and briefly touched his hand. "For what it's worth, I think you're incredibly brave. Most people in your position would choose to stay silent." Alexander shook his head. "I don't feel brave. I feel like I'm betraying everyone who ever trusted me." "You're betraying the people who are abusing that trust," Sarah corrected. "There's a difference." After Sarah left, Alexander returned to the palace with a heavy heart. As he walked through the familiar corridors, he noticed details he had never paid attention to before: the expensive artwork, the golden fixtures, the opulent furnishings that represented centuries of wealth and privilege. How much of that wealth had been built on the suffering of others? That evening, Alexander was summoned to another meeting with the Chancellor. This time, it was just the two of them in the Chancellor's private study. surrounded by leather-bound books and portraits of former royal advisors. "Alexander, my boy, sit down," the Chancellor said, gesturing to a comfortable chair by the fireplace. "I wanted to speak with you privately about the investigation." Alexander's pulse quickened, but he tried to appear calm. "Of course, sir. How can I help?" The Chancellor poured 2 glasses of whiskey and handed one to Alexander. "You've been like a son to me, you know. I've watched you grow from an eager young recruit into one of the finest officers I've ever served with. Thank you, sir. It means a great deal to me. Which is why I'm going to be completely honest with you about something," the Chancellor continued, settling into his own chair. "The situation we discussed in the meeting, it's more serious than I let on. There are certain operations that the palace has been involved in operations that serve the greater good, but might not be understood by the general public." Alexander felt his stomach drop. Was the Chancellor about to confess everything? Sometimes the Chancellor went on. Those of us in positions of responsibility have to make difficult choices. We have to engage with unsavory people, make deals that seem questionable on the surface, all in service of protecting British interests around the world. "I see," Alexander managed to say. "The work we do in Africa, for instance, sometimes requires us to support certain factions over others. The weapons trade, while regrettable, helps us maintain influence in strategically important regions. Money that flows through our charitable organizations allows us to fund intelligence operations that keep Britain safe." Alexander stared at the Chancellor in amazement. The man was actually trying to justify the illegal weapons sales, to present them as patriotic duty rather than criminal corruption. "The problem," the Chancellor continued, "is that someone, without the full context, might misunderstand these operations. They might see them as corruption rather than necessary intelligence work. That's why absolute discretion is so important." "Of course," Alexander said, his voice barely above a whisper. The Chancellor leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Alexander, I need to know that I can count on your complete loyalty in this matter. Not just your silence, but your active support. Can you give me that assurance?" Here it was, the moment Alexander had been dreading. The Chancellor was asking him directly to become part of the cover-up, to actively participate in protecting the criminal operation. Alexander looked at this man who had been his mentor, his father figure, his inspiration for 12 years. He thought about all the kindness the Chancellor had shown him, all the opportunities he had provided, all the trust he had placed in him. Then he thought about the children in those photographs, the families destroyed by conflicts prolonged for profit, innocent people who would continue to die if this operation continued. Sir Alexander said carefully, "You have always taught me that a guard's highest duty is to protect the innocent. That's what I intend to do." The Chancellor's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "I'm glad to hear that, my boy. Protecting the innocent sometimes means making sacrifices that others don't understand." As Alexander left the study that night, he realized that the Chancellor hadn't been confessing, he had been testing. And Alexander had just failed that test in the most spectacular way possible. The war between honor and duty was about to begin. The next morning brought the storm Alexander had been expecting. He was barely halfway through his usual inspection of the Queen's security detail when General Morrison appeared at his side. Flanked by 2 military police officers, Lieutenants, "Hartwell," the general said formally, "you're to report to the security office immediately for questioning regarding unauthorized access to restricted palace areas." Alexander's fellow guards watched in shock as he was escorted through the corridors like a prisoner. These were men who had served under his command, who had respected his leadership, who had never seen their commanding officer treated with anything but the highest regard. The confusion and concern on their faces was almost harder to bear than the humiliation. The questioning took place in a windowless room deep in the palace's security wing. General Morrison sat across from Alexander at a metal table, while Sir Richard Blackwood observed from the corner, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. The atmosphere was cold and professional, a far cry from the warm mentorship Alexander had grown accustomed to. "Lieutenant," the general began, "access logs show that you were in the palace archives on November 8th at 11:47 p.m. This area is restricted to authorized personnel only. What were you doing there?" Alexander had prepared for this moment. But Actually, facing the interrogation was more difficult than he had imagined. I was conducting a routine security sweep as part of my monthly inspections, sir. The security sweep schedule shows no inspection was planned for that area on that date. Sir Richard interjected, looking up from his notes. I sometimes conduct additional inspections beyond the scheduled ones, Alexander replied. I believe in being thorough. General Morrison leaned forward. Alexander, we've served together for years. I've always known you to be an honest man. I'm going to ask you directly, did you remove or photograph any documents from the archives? The moment of truth had arrived. Alexander looked into the general's eyes, seeing genuine concern mixed with disappointment. This was a man who had believed in him, promoted him, trusted him with the highest security clearances. Now Alexander was about to betray that trust completely. No, sir, Alexander lied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. I did not remove or photograph any documents. It was the first outright lie Alexander had ever told to a superior officer, and it felt like a physical violation of everything he had believed about himself. But he knew that telling the truth now would mean the end of Sarah Mitchell's investigation before it could properly begin. The questioning continued for 3 hours. He asked about his personal relationships, his financial situation, his political views, anything that might explain why he would betray the palace's trust. Alexander answered as honestly as he could, while carefully avoiding any admission of guilt. Finally, General Morrison closed his file and looked at Alexander with sad eyes. Lieutenant Hartwell, while we cannot prove that you accessed unauthorized materials, your presence in restricted areas without proper authorization is itself a serious breach of protocol. You are hereby suspended from active duty pending a full investigation. Alexander felt his world crumble. Sir, Sir Richard added, you are to surrender your security clearances, your weapon, and your palace access cards immediately. You are not to discuss this matter with any personnel, media representatives, or outside parties. Any violation of this order will result in immediate criminal prosecution. You are isolating him, cutting off his access to information and his ability to gather additional evidence. Alexander realized that they suspected him, but couldn't prove anything yet. The suspension was designed to prevent him from causing further damage, while they built a case against him. As Alexander cleaned out his office, removing personal items from the desk where he had planned his career and dreamed of serving with honor, he felt the weight of his decision more heavily than ever. His fellow guards avoided eye contact, unsure whether to treat him as a friend or a traitor. The uncertainty in their faces reflected his own internal struggle. That evening, Alexander sat in his small apartment, staring at the official documents that had defined his life for 12 years. His commission as an officer, his medals and commendations, his certificate of service to the crown, all of it now felt meaningless. In trying to serve justice, he had destroyed the career that had given his life purpose and meaning. His phone rang, startling him from his brooding. Caller ID showed his mother's number. Alexander, darling, came her weak but warm voice. I heard from Mrs. Henderson that you were home early today. Is everything all right? Alexander closed his eyes, feeling the full impact of what his decision would mean for her. I'm fine, Mom. Just taking some time off. You work too hard, sweetheart. Maybe this break will be good for you. She paused, and he could hear her labored breathing. The doctor wants to try a new treatment next month. It's more expensive than the others, but my insurance should cover most of it. The insurance she was referring to was provided through Alexander's position with the Royal Guard, insurance that he was about to lose, along with the salary that helped pay for her medications and care. That's wonderful, Mom, Alexander managed to say. We'll make sure you get whatever treatment you need. After he hung up, Alexander sat in the darkness of his apartment and wept. He cried for the career he had lost, for the trust he had betrayed, for the man who had been like a father to him and who now saw him as an enemy. Most of all, he cried for his mother, who didn't deserve to suffer because her son had chosen principle over pragmatism. But even as he grieved, Alexander knew he would make the same choice again. The faces of the victims in those documents haunted him more than his own suffering ever could. 3 days later, Sarah Mitchell called. Alexander, I need to see you immediately. I've been investigating your claims, and what I've found is even worse than what you showed me. They met at the same cafe, but this time Sarah looked excited rather than skeptical. I've been able to confirm most of your evidence through independent sources. I have bank records, shipping manifests, even recorded phone conversations between palace officials and arms dealers. How did you get all that so quickly? Alexander asked. It turns out you weren't the first person to discover this conspiracy, Sarah explained. There are others, a clerk in the legal department, a security guard who noticed unusual meetings, even a member of parliament who started asking inconvenient questions. They were all quietly transferred, demoted, or forced out, but some of them kept records. Alexander felt a mixture of relief and sadness, relief that he wasn't alone in seeing the corruption, but sadness that others had already tried to expose it and been silenced. The story will run tomorrow, Sarah continued. Front page of The Guardian, with follow-up investigations planned for the rest of the week. Alexander, what you've done is going to change everything? What happens now? Alexander asked. Now the real fight begins. They're going to try to discredit you, destroy your reputation, maybe even bring criminal charges.
Oh.
Are you prepared for that? Alexander thought about his mother, about the career he had loved, about the simple life he was about to lose forever. Then he thought about the children in those photographs, about the families torn apart by conflicts funded with British weapons, about the innocent people who would live because the arms dealing would finally stop. I'm ready, he said. But Alexander had no idea just how brutal the price of his principles would prove to be. The Guardian's front page headline read, Palace Corruption Secret Weapons Deals Exposed by Royal Guard. Below it was Alexander's photograph in his dress uniform, alongside images of the documents he had discovered. The story dominated the news cycle within hours, with every major media outlet scrambling to follow up on the explosive revelations. Alexander watched the coverage from his apartment, feeling a mixture of vindication and terror. The secret was out, but now he faced the full fury of the institution he had betrayed. His phone had been ringing constantly since dawn, reporters wanting interviews, former colleagues expressing shock and anger, and threatening calls from unknown numbers. By noon, the palace's response was swift and devastating. A carefully crafted press statement painted Alexander as a disgruntled employee with mental health issues who had fabricated evidence to seek revenge against superiors who had questioned his fitness for duty. They claimed he had been under investigation for erratic behavior and had stolen classified documents before being suspended. Lieutenant Hartwell has a documented history of emotional instability. Read the official statement from Sir Richard Blackwood. His allegations are the desperate fabrications of a disturbed individual who violated his oath and betrayed the trust placed in him. The palace will pursue full criminal prosecution for theft of classified materials and violation of the Official Secrets Act. The character assassination was thorough and brutal. Within hours, stories began appearing in friendly newspapers describing Alexander as a loner who had never fit in with his fellow guards. Anonymous sources claimed he had been passed over for promotion due to poor judgment and had harbored resentment against his superiors for years. The psychological warfare extended to his personal life. His mother received a call from someone claiming to be from her insurance company, informing her that her coverage was being reviewed due to her son's criminal activity. His few close friends were visited by investigators who asked detailed questions about Alexander's mental state and personal relationships. Most devastating of all was the response from Lord Chancellor Pemberton. In a televised interview, the man who had been like a father to Alexander spoke with apparent heartbreak about the betrayal. Alexander was like a son to me, the Chancellor said, his voice heavy with emotion. I mentored him, trusted him with the most sensitive responsibilities, welcomed him into my own family. To discover that he was capable of such deception, such a fundamental betrayal of everything we represent, is personally devastating. The Chancellor paused, seeming to struggle with his emotions. I blame myself in part. Perhaps I should have seen the warning signs, the growing instability, the resentment that was building beneath his facade of loyalty. Pray that he gets the help he clearly needs. Watching the interview from his apartment, Alexander felt something break inside him. The man he had respected above all others was now destroying him with surgical precision. using their personal relationship as a weapon to discredit his revelations. But Sarah Mitchell and her team at The Guardian weren't backing down. Their follow-up stories provided additional evidence, including recorded phone conversations and testimony from other palace insiders who had been silenced over the years. The international media picked up the story, with weapons experts and human rights organizations confirming the devastating impact of the illegal arms sales. Dr. Emma Saunders, director of the International Arms Control Institute, appeared on BBC News to support Alexander's claims. The documents published by The Guardian are consistent with intelligence we've been gathering for years about illegal weapons flows to conflict zones. This isn't the fantasy of a disturbed individual. This is a sophisticated criminal operation that has cost thousands of lives. The tide of public opinion began to shift as more evidence emerged. Protests formed outside the palace gates, with demonstrators carrying signs reading "Justice for Hartwell" and "Stop the Blood Money." International pressure mounted for a full investigation, with several allied governments expressing concern about Britain's role in destabilizing conflict zones. But the personal cost to Alexander continued to mount. Criminal charges were filed against him for theft of classified documents in violation of the Official Secrets Act, charges that could result in decades in prison. His bank accounts were frozen as part of the investigation, leaving him unable to pay for his mother's medical treatments. The breaking point came when Alexander received a call from his mother's doctor. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm afraid your mother's insurance has been canceled. The company claims there were irregularities in your employment status. Without coverage, we'll need payment in advance for her treatment." Alexander stared at the phone in disbelief. "How much?" "It's for the next round of chemotherapy. Approximately £15,000 due before we can begin treatment." Alexander had less than £300 in his personal account, and his frozen assets wouldn't be available until the criminal case was resolved, a process that could take years. That evening, as Alexander sat by his mother's hospital bed, she took his hand with her frail fingers. "Tell me the truth, darling. What's really happening?" Alexander had been trying to shield her from the worst of the scandal, but he could see in her eyes that she knew more than she was letting on. "Ma'am, I discovered something terrible at work. People were doing illegal things, hurting innocent people. Tried to stop it, and now they're trying to destroy me for it." His mother was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with the wisdom that comes from years of loving someone unconditionally. "Your father would be proud of you," she said finally. "He always said that doing the right thing is rarely the easy thing. But Mom, I can't afford your treatment now. I've failed you." She squeezed his hand tighter than seemed possible for someone so ill. "Alexander, you listen to me. I raised you to be a man of honor, not a man of convenience. If I have to die knowing that my son stood up for innocent people instead of staying quiet to pay my medical bills, then I'll die proud." Tears streamed down Alexander's face. "I can't lose you because of a choice I made. You won't lose me, darling. Whatever happens to my body, you'll never lose the part of me that matters. And that part of me is telling you not to give up, not to let them win through intimidation." The next morning brought unexpected news. Sarah Mitchell called with barely contained excitement in her voice. "Alexander, you need to see the morning papers. Something incredible has happened." Alexander hurried to the nearest newsstand, where he found headlines that took his breath away. "Pemberton resigns in disgrace," read the Times. "Palace official admits wrongdoing," declared the Daily Mail. The story revealed that Lord Chancellor Pemberton had been secretly recorded by one of his own staff members, a young woman named Jennifer Walsh, who had grown suspicious of the meetings. She was asked to arrange recordings turned over to authorities overnight. Captured Pemberton explicitly discussing weapons sales and money laundering with criminal associates. But the most damaging recording was a conversation between Pemberton and General Morrison about how to handle the Alexander situation. "The boy is too naive to understand the bigger picture," Pemberton's voice said clearly on the recording. "We need to destroy his credibility completely. Make him look mentally unstable, criminally motivated, anything that discredits his story." About his mother, General Morrison could be heard asking, "She's dying. Cutting off his income affects her treatment." "Collateral damage," Pemberton replied coldly. "We can't let sentiment interfere with protecting the operation." His mother's Suffering makes him look more sympathetic. We'll need to find ways to counteract that. The recordings revealed the full scope of the conspiracy, not just the weapons dealing, but the systematic destruction of anyone who tried to expose it. Jennifer Walsh had also provided bank records showing that Pemberton had personally profited millions of pounds from the illegal arms sales. Within hours of the recordings being published, Pemberton announced his resignation and General Morrison was placed under arrest. Sir Richard Blackwood, faced with evidence of his own involvement in the cover-up, agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. The vindication felt surreal to Alexander. After days of being portrayed as a mentally unstable traitor, he was suddenly being hailed as a hero who had risked everything to expose corruption at the highest levels of government. But the personal cost remained devastating. The criminal charges against him were dropped, but his career in the Royal Guard was over. His security clearances had been revoked. His reputation within military circles was complicated, and his financial situation remained desperate. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Dr. Emma Saunders, the arms control expert who had supported Alexander's claims on television, contacted him directly. "Mr. Hartwell," she said during a phone call, "I run a nonprofit organization that investigates illegal weapons trafficking around the world. We could use someone with your expertise, your integrity, and your first-hand knowledge of how these systems work. The position doesn't pay as much as your guard's salary, but it comes with excellent health benefits." Alexander felt a spark of hope. For the first time in weeks, what would I be doing? Helping us track down other operations like the one you exposed? Working with international law enforcement to stop the flow of illegal weapons to conflict zones? Using your military training and investigative instincts to save lives on a much larger scale than you ever could as a palace guard? The irony was perfect. By losing his position protecting the royal family, Alexander had found an opportunity to protect something much more important: innocent people around the world who were being harmed by the very corruption he had exposed. As Alexander sat in his mother's hospital room that evening, watching her receive the treatment that Dr. Saunders' organization's insurance was now covering, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He had lost his career, his reputation within the palace, and the fatherly relationship with Lord Chancellor Pemberton that had meant so much to him. But he had gained something more valuable: the knowledge that he had chosen justice over comfort, principle over pragmatism, honor over duty to a corrupt system. His mother, looking stronger already after just one round of properly funded treatment, smiled at him from her hospital bed. "So tell me about this new job, darling. It sounds important." Alexander smiled back, feeling lighter than he had in months. "It is important, ma'am. I'm going to help make sure that what happened at the palace never happens anywhere else." But even as Alexander began to rebuild his life, the most difficult challenge still lay ahead: facing the final consequences of his choice and discovering whether justice would truly prevail over the powerful forces that had controlled the system. For so long, 6 months after the scandal broke, Alexander stood in the witness box at the Central Criminal Court, facing the man who had been like a father to him. Lord Chancellor Pemberton sat in the defendant's dock, his once proud bearing reduced to a hunched posture of someone whose world had completely collapsed. The trial had become an international sensation, with media coverage focusing not just on the weapons-dealing conspiracy, but on the moral courage of the Royal Guard who had risked everything to expose it. Alexander had testified for 3 days, methodically detailing how he had discovered the documents, his agonizing decision to go public, and the systematic campaign to destroy his credibility. Now, as cross-examination began, Pemberton's defense attorney launched a final, desperate attempt to discredit Alexander's testimony. "Mr. Hartwell, isn't it true that you had been passed over for promotion several times before discovering these alleged documents?" "No," Alexander replied firmly. "I had been promoted regularly throughout my career and was considered for advancement to deputy commander just months before this incident. And isn't it true that you had expressed resentment toward Lord Chancellor Pemberton for what you perceived as insufficient recognition of your service?" Alexander looked directly at Pemberton, seeing the man who had mentored him, encouraged him, welcomed him into his family. Despite everything that had happened, the personal betrayal still hurt. Lord Chancellor Pemberton was like a father to me, Alexander said quietly. I never resented him. I respected him, trusted him, and loved him like family. That's what made discovering his involvement in this conspiracy so devastating. Pemberton's composure cracked slightly at these words, his eyes showing a flicker of the genuine emotion he had been trying to suppress throughout the trial. The defense attorney pressed on. Mr. Hartwell, you violated your oath of service, betrayed confidences, and stole classified documents. How can this court trust the word of someone who has proven himself willing to break sacred vows? This was the question Alexander had been dreading, but also the one he was most prepared to answer. He stood straighter, his voice clear and strong. I did violate my oath of service to the crown, he said. I did betray confidences and remove classified documents without authorization. I broke rules that I had followed faithfully for 12 years. The courtroom was completely silent, hanging on every word. But I did those things because I discovered that my oath to protect the crown was being used to protect people who were profiting from human suffering. I learned that my loyalty was being exploited to cover up crimes that were causing the deaths of innocent people. Alexander paused, looking around the packed courtroom, seeing faces of journalists, human rights activists, and ordinary citizens who had followed the case. A guard's highest duty isn't blind obedience to authority. It's protecting innocent people from those who would harm them. Sometimes, sadly, that means protecting them from the very people we're supposed to serve. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. In addition to the documents Alexander had discovered and the recordings Jennifer Walsh had provided, investigators had uncovered bank records, shipping manifests, and communications that detailed years of illegal weapons sales. Testimony from arms dealers, intelligence sources, and victims of conflicts in Africa painted a devastating picture of the human cost of the conspiracy. Dr. Michael Okafor, surgeon from Nigeria, testified about treating children wounded by British weapons that had been sold to fuel civil conflicts. His voice broke as he described operating on a 7-year-old girl who had been caught in crossfire from weapons that were supposed to be helping maintain peace. These were not weapons of defense, Dr. Okafor said, looking directly at Pemberton. These were weapons designed to kill, sold to people who used them to terrorize civilians. Every bullet, every bomb, every rifle represented a choice to value profit over human life. The trial's most dramatic moment came when Pemberton himself took the stand in his own defense. The man who had once commanded respect from world leaders now appeared diminished, his voice barely audible as he attempted to justify his actions. Everything we did was in service of British interests, Pemberton claimed. The intelligence we gathered, the relationships we built, the influence we maintained, all of it served to protect British citizens and advance British foreign policy. Lord Chancellor, the prosecutor responded. How did selling weapons that killed thousands of civilians advance British interests? Pemberton struggled to answer, his carefully constructed justifications crumbling under scrutiny. Sometimes difficult decisions must be made by those in positions of responsibility. Did you consider the responsibility to the children who died from those weapons? The families torn apart by conflicts you helped fuel? We couldn't foresee every consequence of our actions. But you could foresee the profits, couldn't you? The £12 million that went into your personal accounts? Pemberton's silence was damning. The verdict came after 3 days of jury deliberation. Guilty on all charges: conspiracy, illegal arms dealing, money laundering, and corruption. Pemberton was sentenced to 18 years in prison, with General Morrison receiving 12 years and Sir Richard Blackwood getting 8 years for his role in the cover-up. But for Alexander, the real vindication came in the months that followed. The palace implemented sweeping reforms to prevent future corruption, with new oversight mechanisms and whistleblower protections. The illegal arms dealing operation was completely shut down. Cutting off a major source of weapons to conflict zones around the world, Alexander's work with Dr. Saunders' organization had led to the exposure of similar corruption networks in 3 other countries. His expertise in military protocols and security procedures, combined with his unwavering commitment to justice, made him invaluable in investigating weapons trafficking operations around the globe. His mother's health had improved dramatically with proper treatment, and she had become something of a celebrity herself, speaking at events about the importance of supporting whistleblowers and the personal costs of standing up to corruption. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Alexander received a letter from a young girl named Amara in Sierra Leone, whose village had been attacked by rebels using British weapons from Pemberton's operation. Mr. Hartwell, the letter read in careful English. My teacher told me about what you did to stop the bad men from sending guns to hurt people like my family.
Bad my?
My little brother was killed in the fighting, but because of you, other children won't be hurt the same way. Thank you for being brave when it was hard to be brave. Alexander kept the letter on his desk, reading it whenever he faced difficult decisions in his new work. It reminded him why he had made the choice that cost him everything he thought he valued, and why he would make the same choice again without hesitation. Standing in his new office at the International Arms Control Institute, looking at photographs of successful operations that had shut down weapons trafficking networks and saved countless lives, Alexander reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He had lost his career as a royal guard, his comfortable life, his relationship with the man who had been like a father to him. He had endured character assassination, financial ruin, and the constant threat of imprisonment. But he had gained something infinitely more valuable than knowledge that he had chosen justice over personal comfort, that he had used his position of privilege to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, and that he had proven that individual conscience could triumph over institutional corruption. Alexander Hartwell had learned that true honor sometimes requires the courage to disobey, that real duty means serving humanity rather than hierarchy, that the price of integrity, while steep, is always worth paying. In choosing justice over tradition, he had discovered who he truly was beneath the uniform and titles. And that person, he realized, was someone he could live with for the rest of his life.